we're going to learn about quadratic equations and how you solve them. First off, a quadratic equation is anything that can be written in the format ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. Basically, it's a polynomial equation where you have an x squared as the highest power. Now, there are several different ways that we can solve quadratic equations. Some of them are faster than others, and then some of them only work occasionally, and some of them will work on any problem. The first one, which is usually considered one of the faster methods, it's called factoring. However, this only works when you get a polynomial that you're able to factor. And when you go through your factoring, you'll see sometimes it can't be done. So, in this case, it's going to work out. I will say that whenever you're doing the factoring method, you need the right-hand side to be 0. So if it's not currently 0, you're going to go ahead and move everything to one side so that it will become equal to 0. Once you've done that, you kind of ignore the 0 part for now, and you say x squared minus x minus 6. Can I factor that? And it does factor as x minus 3, x plus 2. And what does factoring do? It rewrites the expression as one number x minus 3 times another number x plus 2. So we are saying that if you take these two numbers and you multiply them, you're getting the answer 0. But if you think about multiplying numbers, the only time the answer is 0 is if one of the numbers you started with was 0. So that means either the first number had to have been 0 or the second number had to have been 0. And then these are two linear equations. We can quickly solve them. And we get x equal to 3 or x equal to negative 2. So we have two answers to our equation. I will point out a little side note here that occasionally we will see this written as curly brackets 3, negative 2 here. This is not a ordered pair. This is not a point in xy plane. This is what's called a solution set. It's just saying that we're going to use our set bracket notation here and write all the possible solutions inside, and that's what we have. So occasionally you see it written that way, but regardless, either way is fine to give me the answer. Next up is the square root method. Now, this is also a limited method. It does not always work. This one is even more restricted, though. It only works if the left-hand side is a perfect square. And in this case, it is a perfect square. It's x squared. And what you can then do is you can go ahead and take square roots of both sides. And then we would get x equals. And then whenever you put your square root in the problem, you need to put plus or minus there, and the square root of 25 is 5. So that means we have x equals plus or minus 5. Now, if you're not familiar with this plus or minus symbol, what this really means is that you have two answers. One of them is positive 5, and one is negative 5. But mathematicians are too lazy to write it out twice, so we created the plus or minus symbol. Now, the reason why you put plus or minus in there, it comes down to something called absolute value and what the square root of x squared really is. I'm not going to go into that for this video, but when we have a later video on absolute value, you can see it then. Okay, so that's the square root method. Now, this third method is called completing the square. I'm going to be completely upfront with you. I hate this method myself. I try to avoid it at all costs when I'm doing problems myself, and I will let you know that when I assign problems to you, I always let you choose whichever method you prefer on a given problem. However, notice how things like the square root method don't always work, so you have to choose a method that will actually work on the given problem. And completing the square is just a kind of a really big pain, especially for the harder versions of it. However, it's not something we can completely ignore because there are some problems where you really need completing the square. With that said, let's go ahead and solve this problem here. The first thing is that for completing the square, you actually don't want it to be equal to 0. Whatever your constant term is, you need to move that to the right-hand side. Then you are going to add a special number to both sides of the equation. And this special number is going to make the left-hand side into a perfect square. And there's a rule for how to figure out what to add. You take your number, in this case -6, you're going to divide it by 2, and then you're going to square it. So the general formula is b over 2 here, squared. I will also give you a warning that this only works if the number in front of the x squared is a 1, which it is in this problem here. If it was not a 1, we would have had to divide by whatever it was to get a 1 there, which then gives you more fractions and more annoyances on the problem. One of the reasons why I don't like this method. And then we have -6 over 2 is -3. Square that, you get 9. And so 9 is the special number that I'm going to add to both sides. And then let me go ahead and show you why this is going to work. I have x squared minus 6x plus 9. That can be factored into x minus 3 times x minus 3, which is the same as x minus 3 squared. And then the right-hand side, -3 plus 9 is 6. And notice that by doing this, by moving the 3 over and adding the 9, I made it so the left-hand side is a perfect square, which means we can now use the square root method by square rooting both sides. That's why it's called completing the square. And then we'd get x minus 3 here, and then we don't forget plus or minus. Square root of 6 is not a nice whole number. We can't really simplify it there, so we'll leave it alone. And the last step would then be to add 3 to both sides. So we get x is 3 plus or minus root 6, and that will be the final answers here. Remember, that's really two different answers. That's really the answer 3 plus root 6, and then 3 minus root 6. Maybe I'll use curly brackets to make it a solution set. But we use the plus or minus to make our lives a little bit easier. The last method, which is one I found a lot of students like, one of the reasons why is that it always works no matter what quadratic equation you have. Not only that is, once you get used to it, you can just plug in your numbers. You don't have to try factoring and try thinking. Just plug in the numbers and it'll work out the answer here. And it's called the Quadratic Formula. Now there's a song that goes with this one to help you remember it, but I'm not going to sing that for you. Feel free to look on YouTube or something for the Quadratic Formula song. Anyways, so you see we have the negative b, we have plus or minus, square root, b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let's see how this is going to work here. You start with the negative b. Well, the b in my problem here is -6. So if I negative that, I would get positive 6. Then I have my square root here. And b squared, we'll take -6 and square it. You get 36. And then 4 times a times c. 4 times 1 times 3 is 12. All over 2 times a is 2 times 1 is 2. Then we do 36 minus 12 is 24. And notice how the square root of 24, that can be simplified. 24 is the same as 4 times 6. And the square root of 4 is 2. And then this is something I see a lot of students making a mistake on, so be very careful here. I cannot just cancel the 2 and bottom on top there, because I'm adding on top. I have to be multiplying to cancel it out, so I'm going to factor 2 out on top. 3 plus or minus, 1 root 6. And once I make it multiplying by 2 on top instead of adding, I can cancel. And I get the final answer here, which was the same as the completing the square. And it may look like it took me longer because I have more steps here, But as I said, once you get familiar with the quadratic formula, it does move quite a bit faster, and you don't have to try to think about other things, just plugging in and working things out to get to the answer. So it's your choice which method to use, but again, some of them always work, some of them only sometimes work.